Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Partial Kingdom, Part 4, God's Key.
And welcome to the Bowls of Life podcast. I'm Tyler.
And I'm Virginia. And we need to start this over.
Nope, keep going. We don't start it over. Keep going. You're Virginia.
I am. And as we've gone through life, we've learned something important.
What did we learn? That life is messy. That's what we learned. There are a lot of armchair experts out there who will try to tell you how to make life simple.
But it's not. So you won't find any of that here. Instead, you'll find everyday people who have jumped into the mess in life and don't edit their podcast when they mess up because we're just making an adventure of it.
Yeah, we are. We're always making an adventure out of this intro that we should have memorized and 100% do not. But that's okay. It's part of the fun. I enjoy
Absolutely.
it. Yeah. So, what are we kicking off with tonight, babe?
All right. So, for Christmas, I bought Tyler a present.
Yes.
And
just one, no others.
It's like the only present that wasn't on his list. So, I was like, it's gotta be something special, something he doesn't expect, because I don't buy gifts very well. So I went with this.
You do fine.
And it's a book, and it's called the Adventure Challenge, and this is the couples edition. And it's a really cool thing. I got an ad about it when I was scrolling social media, and they knew I needed to buy a gift for my husband. Somehow. But so you get this book, and it's like a scratch and go. So it's a date book, and you have scratch-offs, and you scratch off, and you have to do it like when you scratch it off.
Within 48 hours.
Within 48 hours.
Yep.
And so the rules of this adventure book or adventure challenge is to just kind of disconnect from the world around you, from your job, from your phone, and just reconnect back to the people that you love. And there is a family edition, so that would be really cool too.
Yep.
It does tell you to put your phone on airplane mode, and then if you scratch off a date, you have to do it. And if you don't feel like it, they say, too bad, do it anyway. Discover something new about yourself. The third rule is to document their journey. So you take pictures, you write about it, and then there are actually places in this challenge journal where you can like post your picture, like a literal printed picture. Okay?
It's really meant for like the little Polaroid
like
pictures.
Polaroids.
That's kind of what it makes me feel like.
And of course, they want you to then actually post your picture on social media and hashtag the Adventure Challenge.
Yes.
So this is not an ad. They are not sponsoring us. This is just something fun we thought we would do.
But feel free to sponsor us when you hear this episode.
Yeah, the Adventure Challenge. We're going to have some fun with this. So we haven't done one yet. And tonight we thought we would just scratch one off. We'd read it to you guys on the podcast because you're going to hear this podcast on Friday.
Yep.
And then we're going to plan to do it within 48 hours. And so there are different categories of dates, like, some that are around food, craftiness, getting, deep into each other's feelings, emotions.
Which is definitely what we're going to do. We're going to get deep into each other's feelings, and then we're going to share it with the world on this podcast.
No, and Negative. Then you have like helpful hints, like if you need a babysitter, if it's going to be outside or inside, how much it might cost, and nothing costs greater than $30, and it's always a range because what might be $15 in Mississippi might be $30 in California.
Accurate.
So here we go. I have the penny, and I'm going to scratch off. So we need some music.
Music. Yeah, we'll drop some music, some bed music. Yeah, no, if you do that, then I can't drop music under you.
All right, I'm scratching.
Ooh, there's lots of words on there.
Wow, it's a lot more in depth than I thought it would be.
Let's see, what does it
Don't
say?
It yet.
What
Let me get
does
it all done.
Say?
I don't know.
Can't read
it's
it
3
anyway.
paragraphs. Really, just 3 sentences, but it looks like paragraphs.
It does.
All right, read it.
All right, we are going to create a comic strip with 3 to 6 panels that tell the story of your relationship. You have to draw pictures, write captions, and color it in. Here's the catch. All the words must be written using Chinese characters. You use Google Translate for assistance. For assistance, you mean to do it? Yes.
Right.
If your rear end, we won't use that word, isn't super broke, find a custom comic strip service online and order the comic book of your love story once it's done.
That is hilarious.
Okay. Man, I was really on board, and I was like, yeah, this is no diggity, no doubt. Virginia will draw, I'll talk and do captions. Right. This will be fine.
We can do that.
And then all of a sudden it says, do it in Chinese? What is that garbage?
Well, we have Google Translate, so we just write it in English, and then we translate it.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Interesting.
And if you aren't super broke, we're going to do the broke.
The super broke version.
Yeah, we're going to do the super broke version.
100%. You
weren't expecting that, were you?
No.
So this was apparently a creative one. We chose one of the free ones on purpose.
Yeah, we did.
But yeah, so we got to create a comic strip, which is that's so our thing. Not that we draw comic strips, but you like to read comics.
I do read comics.
And I actually got you a book for Father's Day or it might have been Christmas from Luna. That was like a comic style. So
yeah.
How fun. Okay, guys. Well, we will let you know how it goes in our drawing skills, and you'll see us post it for sure because it's probably going to be pretty comical.
Yeah, it is.
That's the Adventure Challenge Couples Edition. They do have Family Edition too, and some of these things you can include your children. So I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, this will be fun. This will be interesting. I'm still thinking through it, but
don't worry about
time to focus on the rest of this podcast episode. So we have been journeying through the big picture of the Bible, tracing God's storyline through the Bible. I said it wrong. It's God's big picture.
Yeah.
I always want to call it Big Picture of the Bible. I think that's another book. No, it's God's Big Picture, Tracing the Storyline of the Bible by Vaughn Roberts. We are hanging out in part 4.4.
Yes.
Yeah, so we've been journeying through a few things. Virginia, why don't you kind of recap what's been going on?
I'll do my best. All right. So the first episode of this series was the pattern of the kingdom, which we know as God's people, God's rule and blessing in God's place.
Mm-hmm.
And that started with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Absolutely.
Well, then, of course, came the perished kingdom, where sin came into the world, and that ideal world was broken through sin and humanity. And through a few years later, God brought about this man named Abraham and promised him that he would be a father of many nations, and from his descendants would come blessing to all the nations. And that was the promised kingdom.
Right.
And then we led to the partial kingdom, because we know that the kingdom has not been fulfilled quite yet, foreshadowing. But the partial kingdom was God's people in God's place under his rule and blessing, and that was the descendants of Abraham, known as the Israelites. That was God's people. The law was his rule. The blessing was his presence, where they carried him around in the Ark of the Covenant, in the tabernacle. And eventually they got to God's place, which was known as the Promised Land. And now today we are talking about God's king in this partial kingdom.
Right. That was good. You nailed it, babe.
Good.
I love it. So we are talking about God's king. So this partial kingdom, we broke it up into 4 episodes because it covers a vast majority of the Bible, and it just felt like it needed a minute to kind of talk about each one of those, to not just say one thing and move on.
Yeah, and last week I said something like, we're simplifying it. That was kind of a lie.
Yeah.
But what we're doing is just like, we're kind of going through the whole Old Testament and seeing how, through Vaughn Roberts' book, how it all points to Jesus. And that's how we want you to read the Bible. We want you to read the Bible and see how every single bit of it points to Jesus and why we believe what we believe about Jesus. So that's why we're here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the partial kingdom, there's the 3 promises that come straight out of the pattern of the kingdom, and the promises that are given to Abraham. So that first one, God's people, we did an episode. There's a promise literally given to Abraham about people. A promise given to Abraham about rule and blessing, and God's presence is that blessing. There's a promise to Abraham about God's place. This 4th and final part of the partial kingdom isn't actually a promise that's very explicitly given to Abraham, but it is hinted at throughout a few key spots in Scripture, this king. The first one comes right after the perished kingdom, or it's really part of like the consequences wrap up of the perished kingdom, and it's Genesis 3:13 talking about he will crush your head. It's a reference to this person that is going to crush the head of the serpent. And honestly, after Genesis 3, the entire Bible is really a story about searching for this serpent crusher. Because whoever is going to crush this serpent is kind of going to set things back to this ideal place.
That's pretty funny that you say that, because we kind of forget. We read the Bible in sections. We read the New Testament, and then we read the Old Testament, or we read like a story here in Esther, and then a story there in Matthew. But like in its entirety, we hear about God, His people, His rule and blessing, and so on and so forth. And we learn that the whole Bible is looking for this serpent crusher, which is, as we know, Jesus.
Yep, 100%. And so cool. This serpent crusher is going to become a king. Now, you don't get that really explicitly in Genesis 3, but Jacob, who becomes known as Israel, he blesses all of his sons, but specifically he blesses Judah before he dies, and he tells him that one of his descendants, Judah's descendants, is going to rule over all the nations forever. This is found in Genesis 49, verse 10. It says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor." So Judah's descendants are going to be kings, and then ultimately there's going to come this one that all the nations belong to. And that's the king we're looking for here. And so the Israelites, God has brought them into the promised land. That's where we left off, in God's place. They're now in the promised land. They're there and they're living and they're doing their thing. But before God has brought them in, He actually planned that there's going to be a king. He tells them in Deuteronomy 17, Moses is kind of doing his recap thing of Deuteronomy, and he says, look, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you've taken possession of it, you've settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us. This is what you're going to do. You're going to be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law. I didn't know that. I missed that. I think I literally learned that in 2020. Somebody pointed that out. I think maybe it was a podcast I was listening to, that the king is supposed to be this Bible scholar. From the moment he gets on his throne, he's supposed to be writing a copy of God's law. And why would you write a copy of God's law and not just read it? I mean, when you got to read it, then you got to write it. And let's be honest, if you ever try to write something that you were reading, you were like, okay, I read that sentence, I know what it said, and you start writing, and you don't like the third word, and you go, wait, what did it say? And you got to go back and read it again. You are ingraining God's law in that process. The king is meant to be able to own what's in God's law. And so this king, it's going to be to him, the law is going to be to him. He should read it all the days of his life so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of his law. This king would be an authority not separate from God, but under God. It's a king that isn't separate from God, who's not ruling by himself. It's a king who is ruling under God's authority.
So when Moses says that, is he referring to who will be later known as the Messiah, or is he referring to the kings that they're going when they start wanting kings, the actual human kings?
Yeah, that's a solid question. I think it's both.
Yeah,
I think it's a calling for all the kings, but I don't know if Moses knows it. He probably suspects it, but I know God knew, none of you, or very few of you, are actually going to do this. I am pointing to the one to the ideal. Like, I think that's so much of what is happening in Scripture is there's a point to an ideal, and then there's this figure that will be given, some person, somebody that we think could be somebody big and important and special, and as we watch their life unfold, we realize, oh, they don't actually live up to the ideal. And man, kudos to the Bible writers who, like Tim Mackey calls them, they are just ninjas when they write. They write so many little things in there that are giving you little foreshadowings to how people aren't actually living up to being this ideal. We dig into all of that, but we got to keep rolling. Judges. So Book of Judges, you might be kind of familiar with it. What do you know about Judges? How would you kind of sum it up?
It's got a lot of crazy stories in there.
Yes.
They're fun. But they're crazy.
That's accurate. There's a phrase in there that gets repeated pretty often. What's that phrase?
In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit.
Yep. In those days, they had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. That feels pretty accurate.
Everybody just did what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
They were not ruled by anybody. They were not, no boundaries, no governing, no nothing.
Yeah, so this is the time right after Joshua has died, and so there's not really a set leader anymore. Joshua was supposed to be the leader post-Moses, and he was, but then post-Joshua, there's nobody really in charge, and so you start to get this thing where Israel's just on this loop.
Literally, it's like this. It's almost like the same story over and over again.
Yeah.
It's just different things that happen.
Yeah.
In the middle of it.
Yep. And I'm not a huge on timelines on some of this stuff, but I think a lot of these stories might even somewhat be overlapping because the judges in there, they'll say they were a judge over Israel, but they really mean they were a judge over this area of Israel, probably even just like this tribe. So some of the stories probably are overlapping historically.
Just to show you that, like, it's not just,
it's not just this one tribe or this one corner, like, it's all of them.
It's all of them, all the tribes, all the little families, all the people.
Yeah.
But, of course, they're so large that Judges is just trying to show us, like, over here, this is what they were doing. Well, it's basically the same thing over on this side. Mm-hmm. So on and so forth.
Yeah, so pretty much the cycle is the Israelites get there, they get content, they start serving false gods, they get conquered by some little tribe or nation beside them, they eventually cry out to God, God brings a judge to deliver them, and then the cycle just starts over again. Once that judge delivers them, before long, they start serving false gods again. They get conquered. They cry out. God raises up another judge. These judges are supposed to just be a sign of God's grace. They're a sign that God is going, hey, like, you messed up, but I'm going to give grace to you. But they're never a long-term solution. None of them sustain that peace and that they create. And honestly, most of them kind of suck on one level or another. None of them are really good Sunday school lessons to emulate.
Judges?
Yeah, they're like, Gideon has a statue made and people worship his statue.
Yeah.
Samson, I don't know if there's any good redeemable qualities to talk about with Samson. Like, I don't know. There's not much going on there. And I think that's on purpose. I think the Bible writing ninjas are doing their thing and they are leaving us longing for a better leader with a lasting solution.
Yeah. And
so that brings us into 1 Samuel, and Samuel will be the greatest judge to ever rule Israel. Do you remember kind of his mom's story a little bit?
Yeah, Hannah is her name, and Hannah was barren. She wasn't able to have children. And she would be like on her knees crying out to God, praying for a child, because to be barren in those days was like a curse. They thought it was a curse. And she cried so hard that somebody thought she was like drunk up in the church house.
Yeah, it was one of those times she was like begging God, like, please just give me a child. And I don't know, I guess maybe it's one of those moments where you caught up in the spirit, as my Pentecostal friends would say. Yeah. I don't know if it's something along those lines, maybe, but maybe. I mean, she is so in communion, I guess, with God in that moment that she apparently seemed drunk.
Yeah, well, and just someone looking from the outside, like, asked her to leave. You know, like, you're not okay.
Yep.
But anyway, so, she was like, I promise, God, if you give me a child, I would dedicate him to you, to serving you. And that's what she did. So when Samuel was born and weaned, she took him back to the tabernacle to serve God daily for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and I think it's a really noticeable thing that she gave her firstborn to serve others.
Like, she wanted this child, and you would think, like, when she finally got it, she'd keep him all to herself. But she actually gave him back to God and really didn't get to see him much. She got to visit him, but they weren't, like, living in the same household.
Yeah. Can you think of anywhere where someone gave their firstborn son for, to serve others?
I mean, you hadn't seen it yet until you get to Jesus.
Yep. Good old foreshadowings, and I love them. They're always fun. So Samuel, he is a great judge. He rules Israel and points them towards God, but as you do, he got old, and so he appointed his sons as judges in his place. But it turns out, as great of a judge as he was, for one reason or another, his kids weren't the best. They were apparently even wicked, is what the Bible calls them. And so the elders of Israel weren't real fond of him. Samuel's still alive, and so they come to Samuel and they're like, listen, your sons are the worst. So we're going to need a king like all the other nations to rule us. And God gets angry with this request. And it's not because they want a king. It's their motives of asking for a king. See, Israel is supposed to be ruled by God. He's meant to be their king. He's meant to be the one they turn to, and these judges are meant to kind of rule or guide on his behalf. And even a king could do that. But the kind of king they were looking for was a king that was going to give them what they wanted. It was a king that was going to let them do the kinds of things that the other nations were doing. And so God was upset about that, but God gave them what they asked for. I think there's a lesson in that all by itself, that God didn't like what they asked for. But he said, you know what? Here's
a king.
Here's the king you were looking for. And he sounds like it. Like, Saul is this tall, he's this strong, he's handsome, like, he's got a lot of qualities on the outside that sound like what you want in a king. But he turns out not to be the blessing that people wanted him to be, because he continually disobeys God. He does several things along the way, ultimately trying to take the place of a priest at one point, and I think that one was really the last straw for him. He was unwilling to wait for God. He was unwilling to wait on Samuel to get there to do sacrifices, and so God finally, like, outrightly rejects Saul as the king of Israel. He rejects him as his king. And so this is where the focus starts to shift in Israel's storytelling. It shifts from Saul to David. See, now there needs to be a new king. Saul continues to rule Israel as king, but God does not have his blessing on him. And so he tells Samuel, who apparently, even though he got old many years back, is still doing his thing.
He's still working.
Yeah, I don't know. He's one of those pastors that just never did retire. And so God tells Samuel, hey, you're going to go and anoint a new king, and he sends him to, oh gosh, I can't remember where David's family lived at this moment. Was it Bethlehem?
It's Bethlehem.
Yeah, Bethlehem. Duh, I should know that.
Yeah, which is the same place Jesus is born.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so sends him there. Jesse is David's dad. He's got like 8 sons, if I remember correctly. And so one after the other, God's like, nope, not the one, not the one, not the one. And David is so low in this family's like pecking order. I mean, I guess he's young. He doesn't have the qualities to be a leader or a king, or at least he's never shown them. And so they legit didn't even have him at the house. Like, he wasn't even an option to be anointed as king, at least in Jesse's mind.
This is what I think. I think they were like, all right, all the sons, come on, let's go. David, come on, we're going to go, stand before Samuel. He's trying to pick a king. And David's like, nah, I think I'm just going to go hang out by the sheep and write poems and songs.
He probably was writing poems and songs. Oh, my goodness.
He did. He played the harp, his sheep. That's how he shepherded them.
He did.
So, yeah, he was probably like, nah, y'all go ahead, I'm good.
Yeah. But, yeah, the moment he steps into the room, God's like, boom, there he is. That's my king. And so he gets anointed, and he is anointed king by Samuel in secret at this moment. Word somewhat kind of sort of gets out, but not a lot. And so there's anointed king of God, and there's the guy who's serving as king of Israel, and they are two different people, and it creates some tension down the road. But before we get to that tension is the most known David story of all the stories. Tell it to me.
Which one?
Well, I guess there are two. Goliath. Tell me about Goliath.
Oh, yeah. I thought we were jumping ahead to Bathsheba.
No, not yet.
I was like, we're not there yet, Tyler. Yes. So, David, little old boy David, comes to give his brothers some food while they're at war with the Philistines, or Philistines, however you want to say it. And there's this giant who's like 9 foot tall. And, I
can't imagine being 9 foot tall.
Everybody's like, what, afraid and not wanting to go against the Philistines because of this one 9 foot giant. And, I would be afraid too, but
Well, they had probably done some battle. It was just one of those hero moments, like your army, both armies will send a hero so that everybody doesn't have to fight and die.
Right, and
it's like a representative.
He's literally the giant is literally calling out Goliath, and he's like, send out your greatest warrior, and I'll kill him, something. Yep. And so David's like, what the heck, guys? Come on, we gotta fight this dude. We gotta win in the name of the Lord. And everybody's like, okay, David, go back and play with your sheep. Nobody asked you. Go away. This is not your battle. You're too young. And he was like, watch and see. So Saul's like, okay, let's put some armor on him. Didn't fit him. Takes it off. Walks out there with his little slingshot. Pops it one time. Hits him in between the eyes. And he's dead. And they cut his head off. And they parade around with his head.
Yep. I think they kept that thing for a while, too. I'm pretty sure it pops back up in a story, like, years later.
And it's like, this is where Goliath's head was stored.
It's like, wait, you guys are keeping that thing?
What? Did that
like,
not
you got
smell?
You got that man's head?
Did y'all freeze it first?
No, because you can't.
Was it put on salt?
I don't know. That's so
weird. What did
weird.
the eyeballs look like?
Ugh. There's so many questions and not enough answers. But so this moment it's a demonstration that God's presence is with David, because there's no way little teenage whatever David killed big old 9 foot Goliath with one rock that goes through what I assume was a helmet first and then sinks into the guy's skull. Like, no, you are not that strong. Yeah, you're a shepherd boy and you fought off the lions or whatever. I don't know if I buy it, David. You might have been exaggerating in your poems, but either way, that is literally God's presence on him.
Yeah.
He will actually go on to kind of serve Saul for a while. He'll be kind of like a general for him, but even before he was a general, he played the harp for Saul, because Saul, he had what I would call bipolar disorder or a demon. Either one is probably possible. But yeah, he needs somebody to play the harp for him. And
yeah, David would play him music to help him sleep and help him feel better, which is just, that's so beautiful. So nice.
What a warrior poet. Like,
yeah.
I mean, he is legit movie-worthy David, man.
Right.
I don't know. That's wild. So they'll go through years of tension. There will be moments where David has opportunities that he could have killed Saul, but he doesn't because of his respect for God. He doesn't take the life of the king of Israel. There's all kinds of crazy stories to dig into. We won't today. But eventually Saul dies in a battle. And so after Saul dies, David will finally become not only the anointed king, but the ruling king of Israel. So we're going to dig into David a little bit right after this quick break. All right, well, we are back and we're going to dig into King David. So King David, he has a very famous phrase that God himself actually speaks about David. Mm-hmm. What is it?
Man after my own heart.
A man after God's own heart. Mm-hmm. Talk to me. What is a man after God's own heart in your mind? What do you think about when you hear that?
Well, obviously someone who seeks the Lord.
Yeah.
Probably in scripture and prayer, which we know David did.
Yeah, he even wrote some.
And obviously he made decisions that honored God, like not killing Saul with the many opportunities that he had.
Yep.
Like he could have even probably said, "Oh, this is my sign to kill Saul."
Right. There was one time, I wasn't going to talk about it, but I just have to. Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself of some bodily functions. And it turns out David and all of his army, or at least his close homies in the army, I don't know, are in the back of the cave. And so David just sneaks up behind him and he's like, "Nah, can't kill him. Guess I won't." So he goes and hides without Saul ever knowing. And Saul leaves, and apparently they get far enough away where David yells out, he's like, "Hey, I was in the cave and I totally could have killed you, but I didn't. Just wanted you to know." Such a moment. I don't know.
Yeah, David.
Yep.
Anyways, man after God's own heart.
Yeah, that he is. So yeah, he gets to start being the actual ruling king of the nation of Israel, but it takes time for all of the tribes to recognize David as king. As a matter of fact, it starts out where Judah is the only tribe that owns him. They're like, "Nah, he's our king," but over time they start to all recognize him as king. He'll go on to make Jerusalem the capital city. He'll secure all of the land of Israel. There's going to be peace in the land. The ark and the tabernacle, which symbolize God's presence, they're going to be taken into Jerusalem. David rules, but he doesn't rule independently of God. He rules under God. Israel has never enjoyed this kind of peace and prosperity. And this kind of feels like the moment. Like Moses talked about a king that was going to rule under God. It's starting to feel that way. Like maybe we're there.
The serpent crusher.
Maybe he's the serpent crusher.
Mm-hmm.
But David isn't a perfect king. You can just ask Bathsheba and poor husband Uriah. David takes advantage of Bathsheba, and you can draw some conclusions as to what exactly that really means. And then he ends up having her husband killed, and for her husband to get killed in battle, several other guys had to die in battle as well to cover up this thing that David had done. It ends up leading to a plague, if I'm not mistaken, on Israel as part of the punishment for what he's done. And so David is very clearly not the serpent crusher, and he's not the great ruler that was promised in Genesis. And so 2 Samuel 7, God through the prophet Nathan will go on to prophesy about a king who's going to be greater than David. David's this great king. He's the one, he's arguably the king of Israel in a lot of ways, but it's clear that he's not the right king. He's not the prophesied king. And so Nathan, because God gives him this vision, this promise, he talks about this future king that's going to be far greater. And this future king, he's going to fulfill the covenant. It's going to bring all of these promises of God. And he's told to be the son of David and also the son of God. And it's from this point forward that the Bible starts to await not only this serpent crusher, but also God's king, the son of David, the Messiah. And fun fact for you, if you've ever wondered why Jesus' last name is Christ, it's not. Christ is literally just the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah, both of them meaning the anointed one. Just fun facts for you. And so that kind of closes out 2 Samuel for us and brings us on to the son of David that will be the next king. Who's the next king?
So the next king is the son of Bathsheba and David. We didn't actually mention that he got her pregnant, but...
Yes, he does. Well, that son dies, though. This is their next son, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyways.
But yeah.
And he succeeds David as king, and he is known as the wisest king, wisest person there ever was, and there's a reason for that. Yep. But he was able to bring more security and prosperity to the Israelites in their land.
Yep. Yeah, while David brought a ton of peace to Israel, a lot of that peace was more internal peace. There was still external peace and external battles that happen. When Solomon becomes king, honestly, no one wants to fight with Israel. There's very little battle happening during his reign because everyone sees Solomon and the great king that he is, and they go, we don't really want to mess with that.
Right.
And so in Solomon's time, as he's becoming king, God gives him a vision, and he asks him, he says, hey, I can give you one of these things. I can give you fame, I can give you fortune, or I can give you wisdom. And Solomon chooses wisdom. And God says, because you have chosen the right thing... Wisely. Turns out maybe he already had a little wisdom. Yeah, but he chooses wisdom. God said, I'm also going to give you the fame and fortune, which means your country fame and also your country fortune. And so under his time, Solomon will go on to build the first ever temple, the first ever permanent symbolic dwelling place for God. And the completion of this temple is really the pinnacle of the Old Testament outside of Genesis 1 and 2. Like, of every moment from Genesis 3 all the way to the end of the Old Testament, this moment, this completion of the temple, that's the peak. That's the moment. When he prays at the dedication, he says, praise be to the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed all of the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. And so let's think back to the promises that God has given. There's God's people. Mm-hmm. Well, we've got Israel. They're right. God's people. And according to 1 Kings 4:20, the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashores, which was promised in Genesis 32.
Right.
Well, then there's God's place. Well, 1 Kings 4 tells us Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River in the north to the land of the Philistines and the border of the Egypt in the south. And that was promised to Moses in the Exodus. And then God's rule and blessing, well, the ark is in God's temple. And in 1 Kings 8, this is that symbolization of God's presence, and it points to Israel submitting to God's rule. And they're blessed because during the lifetime of Solomon, all of Judah and Israel lived in peace and safety. And from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, each family had his own home and his own farm. I mean, if you're living in an agricultural society, you've got your house and your farm.
That's all you need.
You got it. You're there. You are in your ideal place. And so they're not only blessed themselves, they're a blessing to the nations around them. Queen Sheba comes and she sees all that Solomon and his kingdom has done, and she even blesses God in that moment. They are a blessing to the nations around them. So now the moment's finally come, right?
Right. It's Solomon.
It's Solomon. Solomon's the king we've been waiting for all this time. No. Solomon, like his dad, he falls, and he shows that he is not the serpent crusher or the great ruler. He'll choose to marry women who worship foreign and false gods, and will begin to worship those false gods himself.
It's quite amazing the amount of wives and concubines Solomon had.
I gotta assume he didn't, barely met many of them ever. Mm-mm. At the marriage ceremony, was probably about it.
That doesn't even make sense.
I think most of them, as I've come to understand it, they're strategic
agreements,
political marriages.
Right.
It's like, hey, if you'll marry my daughter and you guys have a kid together, we're family, and family won't fight. I mean, that's basically what it is. And so, yeah, it's like 600 and something, isn't it?
No, it's like 700 concubines and like 1,000 wives, or vice versa.
Crazy number. That's insane.
I could be saying that wrong, but I remember that number pretty well. I feel like because it always just blew my mind. And even like talking about having kids, there's no way. There's
goodness.
Way.
I mean, that's literally every day.
How many kids are running around? How many of us are just like literally directly under Solomon?
Gracious, I hadn't even thought about that. Like, I mean,
could be.
You're everybody's 6 steps removed from Kevin Bacon or something like that. I mean, maybe. Yeah, so that brings us all the way through 1 Kings 11, because when Solomon dies, it causes a civil war and the kingdom begins to disintegrate. Remember, I told you we had just reached the pinnacle, so now we're on the downside of the bell curve, and it's just going to get worse. So there's a king after Solomon. It is his son, Rehoboam. He comes to the throne, and he makes it very clear, very quick, that he's not going to be a good king. And the kingdom, the tribes, they're not going to have it. They said, we worked hard under your dad to build this kingdom to make it great, and you just want to basically treat us like slave labor even worse than your dad did? Yeah. So we're not going to have it. So the kingdom breaks into 2 kingdoms. And so this is where it can get a little confusing, but I'm going to be a little Bible nerdy for just a minute, so bear with me.
Oh, gosh.
Just 2 seconds.
Can't just be there's a north and a south.
But I read a thing, and I want to talk about it. I promise, for just a second.
That's what the podcast is for. Go ahead.
I know. So, Northern Kingdom, they're going to be known as Israel, which is super confusing because the complete one nation was known as Israel, but the North, they're going to call themselves Israel. Their first capital is in a place called Shechem, and they'll later be Samaria. Remember Samaria, Samaritans, same people, somewhat. So, there's 10 tribes that go to the north. Mm-hmm. So we got Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali. I never know how to say that one right. Reuben, Zebulun, and maybe Simeon. We'll talk about it. All right, so Southern Kingdom, they're going to become known as Judah. They keep their capital of Jerusalem. And this is going to be Judah and Benjamin, and maybe Simeon. We'll talk about it in a second. But there's actually one tribe we didn't even mention there.
The Levites.
The Levites. So the Levites have no land. They are actually dispersed through several major cities in each tribe. So the Levites are kind of everywhere. A decent amount of them are probably in Jerusalem, but they're just everywhere.
Right.
They don't have a home. And see, that's also going to be the problem with Simeon. So Levi and Simeon, they're the ones who go and kill off like a whole people group after their sister is brutally taken advantage of, and because of that, Jacob kind of peripherally like curses them instead of blesses them when he dies, and so he tells them like, you guys are really not going to have a land amongst our people.
Oh yeah, so this is where they went back out and fought for the Gad, I think, or something like that, or Gilead. I can't remember what it was called.
No, I think we're talking about different things. This is back in Genesis when it's just the 12 sons.
Okay.
Yeah, so actual Levi and Simeon go and do some things. But anyway, they're not going to get a land, so the Levites don't get a land because they're the priests. Well, Simeon really doesn't get a land either. When their land is distributed, they just get a couple of cities, but all the cities are in the south in the middle of Judah. But there's this theory because later years, Simeon only ever gets mentioned with the northern kingdom, that a lot of them probably migrated up north because they got tired of being in the middle of Judah, basically. And so we really don't know where Simeon is, but without mentioning Levite, we actually counted 12, and then when you include the Levites, there's 13 tribes, which is really confusing, but it's because Joseph doesn't have a tribe.
Yeah.
His 2 sons are a tribe.
Right.
And so there's really technically 13 tribes. All right, and so that was my Bible nerdy moment. I know, I wanted to have it. Here you go. Sorry. So there's a northern and a southern kingdom.
Yes.
That was what you wanted me to say. There's a northern and a southern.
You know. I like the detail. It is actually really interesting.
Yep. But yeah, so tell me a little bit. Do you know how kind of the story tracks in the future for these kingdoms?
This is where it gets muddy for me.
Sure. So keep it 30,000 feet.
What I remember is that Judah seems to be the southern kingdom because of Judah. I think seems to be the better kingdom.
Better, but not good
in relative terms.
Yes.
But for the most part, it just was downhill. It almost is like reminiscent of the Judges. Like
yes.
Like now we have kings, but they're just one after the other. Like they're terrible. And I mean, this is years and years and years that are passing by.
Absolutely.
And every now and then there's like a decent king or a good king who actually like tries to follow the Lord. But then he dies and like another one comes up and just totally screws everything up. So, downfall from there, but that's about all I got.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's talk about the northern kingdom for a minute and what happens to them. So their first king, a guy named Jeroboam, he was the one who really led the kingdoms to split. King Jerry. Well, sure, there's a couple of them that could kind of fit that category, but we're going to go with it. King Jerry. So he knows if the people continue to worship God down in Jerusalem, there's a chance they might just go, hey, you know what? Let's make Rehoboam king over everything. And Jeroboam, of course, doesn't want that because he's king over 10 tribes. So he sets up 2 alternative shrines to the temple in Jerusalem at a place called Bethel and a place called Dan, and he uses 2 golden calves.
I just don't know why they do
Come
that.
on! I mean, I know. I understand intellectually that Baal, however you say it, is representative by a golden bull. I get it. But come on, guys. Did you not read your Bible? Do you not know that... Moving on. So, this sin sets the tone for the Northern Kingdom's history.
So, basically, I want to break this down just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, Jerusalem, in the Southern Kingdom, is where they had the tabernacle.
Yes.
That's where they met.
The temple.
Then known as the temple, yeah, after it's been built.
Yep.
That's where, you met with God, you sacrificed, so on and so forth. Because of the separation of these 2 kingdoms, now the Northern Kingdom does not have Jerusalem in their
territory.
Geographical area.
Yep.
Geographical area. I left out a synonym.
Happens.
I mean, I can't even talk.
Keep going.
Anyways, syllable. That's what I was trying to say. So they don't have a place to worship the Lord, so they say, we're going to make our own. So that's what these shrines are, what the 2 calves are. So I don't know if I made 100%. That any better understanding.
No, you were good. And literally the phrase is, and these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt.
And that's just a lie.
False. Yeah, so
they literally don't have a clue, I don't think.
They don't. As Tim Mackey refers to the Old Testament as a minority report. AKA, this is the group of people who actually worshiped God, who kept the Old Testament, who wrote it all down, and the majority of people didn't.
Yeah.
So Northern Kingdom, it ends up being destroyed in 722 BC, and remember BC's count down to 0. So it's destroyed in 722 BC when the Assyrians attack Samaria, their capital, and they destroy it. And 2 Kings tells us why this happened. 2 Kings 17. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God who had brought them out of Egypt. And there it is. Mm-hmm. And so the 10 northern tribes...
And let me just stop and say that that statement does not really tell what happened.
Oh, no.
The Israelites sinned against the Lord. Yeah, the Israelites had sinned against the Lord
forever.
For years and years and years, and God continuously showed them mercy.
I mean,
He finally had enough.
Yep. Yeah, and so they're destroyed, and the 10 northern tribes, they're never going to have a separate existence again. Their descendants are the Samaritans, technically, and then other people that we just genuinely can't track them to, because what Assyria would do is they would take like half of your people and take them into exile somewhere, and they'd take exiles from other people and bring them into your area, because they felt like if they split you up, it would remove your national identity
and you remove your power.
Yeah, you'd be less likely to rebel.
Right.
And so
you don't know who is your leader.
Well, you know who your leader is, but you just don't have a group there.
Right.
Like a geopolitical group, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the couple of exiles that stayed, and then these other exiles from some other place come in, they'll ultimately end up intermarrying, and they'll become the Samaritans that the Jewish people in New Testament times hate, and they hate them because they track back to this and go, you guys could have been Jews, but you're not. I mean, it's classic racism is really what it boils down to.
And even, like, what's racism for religions?
I don't know a good word for that.
I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah.
So just to, again, I'm going to break it down a little bit.
Hit it.
The Northern Kingdom God had had enough. He sent in this powerful nation, Assyria, and wiped them out.
Yep.
And when you hear about the Israelites, quote unquote, being in exile, this is what it's referring to. When the Israelites were taken from their home and dispersed among wherever the Assyrians took them.
And those group of exiles that the Assyrians take away, little to none of them will ever even have family descendants that come back to the promised land of God.
Like at this time,
they're done.
At this point, the promised land is not, like, it's still God's place, but his people are no longer, and for the Northern Kingdom, are no longer residing there.
Yep. So the Southern Kingdom, and they decline too. It just takes a minute longer. They've got the temple, and the people still manage to turn and worship other gods.
Yeah.
There's some short periods where the people are more obedient to God, like King Josiah. He has a lot of religious reform after he finds a copy of the law in the temple.
Again, let's stop. Josiah finds a Bible, basically, scripture.
The law.
The law, the Torah. In this broken down temple. Mm-hmm. And was it broken down? Yeah.
Yeah. They're in the process of repairing it.
And he finds this scripture, and he's like enlightened to who God is.
Yep.
And how they are supposed to live. The word is living, and it still is today. And all it took was him reading the word to remember, like, oh, we're supposed to be following this God who created us.
Yep. But unfortunately, even though he's very zealous for God, his zeal isn't enough to change the hearts of everyone. It's not enough to restore a whole kingdom. And so Babylon will defeat Judah in 597 BC. So like 150 years later, after Israel, the northern kingdom, falls, Judah is defeated by Babylon, and they'll take some of the inhabitants of Judah into exile, but not all of them. They'll actually set up a vassal king, which means basically a puppet king for Babylon. But the puppet king decides he's going to revolt, and it doesn't go well. And so Babylon will return in 586 BC, so about 11 years later, and they just destroy Jerusalem. They just waylay everything. The temple, the city walls, all the buildings, it's just gone. And then they take a large majority of people into exile. And so now the exile is legitimately fully there.
And can I just stop and say one more time? An exile, like, can you imagine just being, like, ripped out of your home?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what happens.
Ripped out of your home and
they are
led
literally
somewhere else.
Marched
to
other parts of the kingdom of Babylon. Some of the Psalms are literally laments that are happening as this is happening. Like, yeah, it's craziness. Yeah, but I mean, all of this stems back to a warning that God gave to the nation before they ever entered the promised land. He said, if you disobey me, if you turn to other gods and you stop worshiping me, I'm going to kick you out of this land. I paraphrase. And that's exactly what he does. And so the partial kingdom that at two good moments with David and Solomon, both of them, like you're right there and you go, oh, we might be there. That golden age is gone. It's done. I mean, there's little evidence that this exiled people are God's people anymore. Like, some of them will still worship God, but many of them will just integrate and become Babylonians. They're definitely not in God's place. And they're not under his rule and blessing. They are under his curse, under his judgment. And it looks like the fall of Genesis 3 has just happened all over again. Because if you think about David and you think about Solomon, I mean, they both had their flaws and their sins, no doubt. But as the nation as a whole, like, you get this feeling of like, we're there. We're basically as close as we can get. And now it's just all been ripped away. So God's work among the Israelites, though, it was never meant to be the final fulfillment of his gospel promises. It was never really meant to be the good news. Within the context of the whole Bible, when you read it all, when you look at the big story, you're seeing the history of Israel as a model. This partial kingdom is a shadow of what the ideal kingdom that God is going to establish through Jesus. It's a shadow. Like, it kind of looks like you. Like, if you look at your shadow, like, I see my shape, but you could also be that dog that casts a shadow and he thinks he's Batman. Anybody? Meme? Hopefully. Yes. Okay, good. I'm glad you knew what I was talking about. Like, he thinks he's Batman because of the shadow he sees. Like, it does, like, it looks sort of right, but it's not. The partial kingdom, the nation of Israel, it looks close, but it's nowhere near the ideal that's going to happen through Jesus. The Egypt rescue is nothing compared to the rescue Jesus is going to pull off. God's presence in a tabernacle and a temple do not compare to the presence of God in Jesus on earth and then the Holy Spirit inside of his people.
Wow.
And David and Solomon, they were good kings for the most part, but they can't compare to King Jesus. So the partial kingdom was never meant to be the fulfillment. And that's hard to swallow if you're an Israelite, especially living in that time. But I mean, I feel like it's even hard for us as modern day Christians because we just never, at least I never heard it explained that way.
Yeah.
I don't know, we missed something in Sunday school because we were kids, or we just didn't know, or we didn't have time to share it all. But man, when I start to really hear and understand that the Old Testament is a storyline showing me a glimpse of what could potentially be, just even like a little portion of what some of the goodness could be, then it starts to make a little more sense as to what its purpose is, what it's there for.
Yeah.
It's not just, here's some history about this nation and eventually Jesus gets here. It's, hey, look at just a glimpse of what could be if you would follow me and what will be if you don't.
Yeah, the story of David and Goliath is not about a story of a guy who was strong, but small and stood up for what he believed in. It's not just about that. I mean, that's great and all, and you can relate to David and be like, I should be brave and bold like David is. It's about the fact that Jesus was the serpent crusher that we are trying to get through the line of David, who came out of nowhere, shepherding his sheep, and defeated an enemy.
The Bible is one story that's leading to Jesus. So we're at the end of the partial kingdom, and God has rejected the model. But he hasn't forgotten his promise. And the prophets are going to stress that. This decline of Israel, this decline of Judah, it's not out of God's control. God is still in control. He is dismantling it because of their sin, but this is not the end. That's the story that the prophets tell. They look and go, hey, turn, and maybe this won't happen right now, but listen, it's coming. And on the other end of it, on the other side of it, God's going to do something. So he's not going to rebuild the model. Israel will come back, but man, it's not the same. He's not rebuilding that model. He's going to establish the real thing, the real kingdom of God in and through Jesus. And that's the story we're going to roll out in the next episode, The Promised Kingdom. In the meantime, I need you guys to do a few things, and I'm super excited about this first thing I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to head on to YouTube and search Bowls of Life and subscribe to our channel there. We are uploading our podcast as videos as well, so you can see the facial expressions we make at each other. Sometimes we're nodding in agreement and we're super listening, and sometimes we're thinking about the next thing we need to say.
Sometimes we're yawning because it's normally 9 o'clock or after.
Absolutely. So you can hang out with us and see us. If you ever thought, man, I wish I could watch Tyler and Virginia on my TV while I'm doing stuff around the house,
we'd like to join you in your living room.
Oh my gosh, we can be wherever you are.
BFFs.
Forever. Isn't that what that means?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I know stuff.
Right.
Yes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast.
Yep, and after you subscribe to the podcast, just make sure you share it with somebody. You can rate and review us on whatever platform you are listening from, but if you rate it on Apple Podcasts, I think that somehow gets us a little bit more traction.
Yep, people see things, and we love it when they see things.
We feel like we got good stuff to say, and we hope you agree. So share it with somebody, and so somebody else can hear what we're talking about, the good news of Jesus. Give us a review, just tell us what you think, and then go to anchor.fm/bowlsoflife and tell us what is messy in your life that you are loving. We would love to feature you on the podcast episode. We'll record that for us. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
See you guys.